This series is all about universes, multiverses, planets, worlds, continents and cities. We're delving not into specific games, but into the Milieux created for them. We'll be looking at where these settings came from, their major features, and why you should consider them for your own gaming experiences. One of the worlds of role-playing form and fame that has been both a constant form of fascination for me and a template of sorts, at least in the guise of unintended encouragement, has been Greg Stafford's fantasy Bronze Age setting of Glorantha, the milieu most commonly and most closely associated with RuneQuest in name and game. It is with some nervous trepidation that I, in today's view of the milieu, take you on what can only be a surface-level tour of this place, of many depths in the time allotted to us. Hopefully at least some of my love for this venerable world will rub off on you on the way. Once upon a time, a man created an entire mythology and legendarium in order to transcribe a history through which his linguistic fabrications would develop and evolve. That man was, of course, Tolkien, and his creations became the works of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and attendant works that we know today. In the 1960s, another man, Greg Stafford, similarly sought to create an invented setting to explore and further his own learning, in this case within the subject of mythology itself. What better way to understand mythology than to create one? This exploration delved into the beliefs and practices of the tribes and peoples of Dragon Pass, a crossroads region contested by different emerging powers and central to the unfolding and expanding workings of Stafford's mind. This conflicted area became the basis for a board game, White Bear and Red Moon, later known simply as Dragon Pass in future editions, which in 1975 Stafford founded a game company, the Chaosium, in order to publish it. The world of Dragon Pass was expanded by a second board game, Nomad Gods, in 1977, which dealt with the conflicts between various beast-riding tribes of the sparse land of Prax to the east of the pass. Neither of these games mentioned the name of the world, but provided some information on the factions depicted within their boards and playing pieces. In 1978, with the publication of the role-playing game RuneQuest, the name of this world, Glorantha, was revealed, and even more tidbits were released within that game's pages to the public. Since then, Glorantha has been a continually evolving project, through supplements for the early editions of RuneQuest and Worm's Footnotes, a Glorantha-dedicated magazine that ran from 1976 to 1982, through to the various supplements and box sets that evolved, compiled and expanded a lot of this early material through the third edition period of the game. Importantly, Stafford had a pivotal volume published during the RuneQuest 3rd edition era, through which Glorantha had been relegated from the focus of the game to one of the few settings that could be used with the game, which for me was an odd move to make, since the basic role-playing game had already been pushed forward as a generic multi-purpose version of the RuneQuest fundamentals. That book was the King of Sartar. This volume is important as it sets out the future history of Glorantha, as depicted originally within the White Bear and Red Moon game. I'll delve more into why this is an important thing to note when we get to the features section, but just to keep it in mind for the time being. With the enforced hiatus on RuneQuest materials during the legal limbo post-RuneQuest 3rd edition, Glorantha itself continued on in articles written by Stafford and other scholars that have come to know the world, in online forums and fanzines. Eventually these coagulated into Isseries, a company set up by Greg Stafford to manage works pertaining to Glorantha. To backtrack a little, Avalon Hill, who had partnered with Chaosium to bring about RuneQuest 3rd edition in 1984, only had rights to the RuneQuest name, not Glorantha. Those remained with Stafford. Following the end of 3rd edition's run, Avalon Hill attempted to get another edition of RuneQuest off the ground, one proposed iteration being a return to RuneQuest being the game of Glorantha. This proposal was shelved in 1994, with Stafford refusing to give permission for Glorantha to be used, given the mishandling that it had received during the 3rd edition's era. Following on from that, Isris came into being in 1997 as a body to exert control over the rights to Glorantha and their use within the publishing sector, after Stafford had obtained full ownership of them from Chaosium. Now things get a little messy, but bear with me. Over in the UK, a company called Reaching Moon Megacore had been publishing Tales of the Reaching Moon from 1989, a fanzine dedicated to Glorantha. Rick Meinst, an American who worked on the Tales magazine, along with one Colin Phillips, set up another company, Moon Design Publications, in 1998. Meanwhile, an initiative was run with Isris in order to raise the capital needed for the company to enter into the publication field with a new Gloranthan game. This ultimately arrived at the Hero Wars role-playing game, written by Robin D. Laws, and arriving in 2000. This new game was originally intended to be called HeroQuest, but the rights to that name were still held by Milton Bradley for their board game. So the game was initially named Hero Wars, but reverted to the HeroQuest moniker as the rights to that title cleared in 2003. In 2004, Isris was put on pause after Stafford moved to Mexico. When he returned in 2005, HeroQuest was licensed to Moon Design, and a second edition was released in 2009, which removed many of the ties to Glorantha. Isris sold the HeroQuest trademark to Moon Design in 2013, leaving them to return it to Glorantha with another revision in 2015. With the sale of the HeroQuest name to Hasbro, who have used it to re-release the old Milton Bradley game, Moon Design have, since 2020, kept the game as a free system reference document under the name Quest Worlds. There's some space to fill in here, so let's take another step back. This time to 2006. Mongoose Publications acquired a license from Isris to publish their own version of RuneQuest, the name having reverted back to Stafford after Avalon Hill failed to create a follow-up to 3rd edition. Mongoose's RuneQuest was an odd limbo. It had rights to the name, but it could not be a facsimile of any previous iteration of RuneQuest itself. Chaosium still owned the rights to the underlying system. So Mongoose RuneQuest took some recognisable elements of basic role-playing and crafted a newish system from that. This edition of RuneQuest was a generic game, with many properties receiving Mongoose RuneQuest treatments during its run. 2000 AD's Slain, Moorcock's Elric and Hawkmoon, Lieber's Lankmar, and of course Stafford's Glorantha, among others. The Glorantha depicted by Mongoose was somewhat adjusted from the familiar Glorantha that people had become used to through the Chaosium and Isris. Mongoose's Glorantha was set within the Imperial Age, or Second Age, roughly 1,000 years before the period familiar to most Gloranthan players. The general reasoning was to keep Mongoose Glorantha and Isris Glorantha separate, without risking overlapping materials. As it was, Mongoose did unto Glorantha as they continue to do with their general modus operandi: release too much, too quickly. For a world as finely tuned as Glorantha, this didn't work particularly well. Anyway, that's Mongoose's attempt at Glorantha dealt with, and we won't dwell on it further. So back to Isris and Moon Design. Moon Design essentially became the major publisher of Gloranthan works following Stafford's return from Mexico, with Isris as rights holders and Moon as publisher. Jeff Richard came on board in 2008 as a co-owner with Meints of Moon Design and as principal designer for all things Glorantha. Richard would be instrumental in bringing Glorantha back from the brink to its current relative renaissance, but we'll get there. First, catastrophe must happen. As for Isris itself, that was sold to Moon Design in 2013, effectively bringing most of the rights together, with a major final missing piece. To let everyone know that they were serious about ensuring the future of Glorantha, Moon Design created the monstrous Guide to Glorantha, a huge 2-volume encyclopedia with accompanying atlas that I believe any author, role-playing or otherwise, needs to have in their library as an example of thoughtful and homogeneous world building. Let's get back to that cataclysm. I make no secret about Chaosium being one of my favourite game companies, and it was with Chthonian dread that I read the news of its impending doom around 2015. So far, I had lived through the demise of companies such as TSR, GDW and Iron Crown, and here was another stalwart of the hobby on the ropes. Greg Stafford and Sandy Peterson, originators of the company in the first place, had left in the late 1990s, but had remained shareholders of it throughout. They stepped back in to unravel the mess the company had got itself into, eventually inviting Moon Design into a merger. This happened, and Chaosium was saved, with the management team of Moon Design forming the new team heading up Chaosium. And now, all of the pieces were falling into place. After this, it was no surprise when the Design Mechanism, another company within the RuneQuest licensing soup, who had essentially inherited the RuneQuest license from Mongoose, along with the principal authors of Mongoose's second edition of RuneQuest, not detailed in this video so much as it has nothing to do with Glorantha at all, announced that it had lost its license to produce RuneQuest, or rather, a game like RuneQuest that used the name RuneQuest. And so the final piece of the new renaissance fell into place. RuneQuest Adventures in Glorantha arrived thereafter in 2018, a glorious remarriage of Glorantha and RuneQuest, a world reunited with the rules that were written for it in the first place. Since its release, the good folk at Chaosium have released a steady but not overblown stream of supporting volumes describing various aspects of the world. Not only that, but they initiated the Johnstown Compendium, a marketplace using the toolbox of Drive-Thru RPG that provides a place where independent authors of Gloranthan materials can get their work out in a semi-curated manner. And thus far, there have been some fantastic volumes released via the compendium. And that brings us up to date with this history section. Glorantha is a world that was created to explore mythology, designed to support gaming, and has been continually explored, examined and tweaked for nearly 6 decades. If I may be so bold, not even Middle-earth comes close to its depth of detail and examination, let alone any other setting created for gaming. The primary feature of Glorantha, for me, lies within the detail it provides to its mythology. What it doesn't fall foul of is attempting to port facsimiles of gods and cultures from Earth, as many RPG worlds are prone to doing. Instead, its mythology is hand-woven from the ground up, taking on board some basic assumptions in that the gods are real and present, and play a hand in everyday lives of people. Gods can possess many forms and names and cross into multiple pantheons, not due to cultural interpretation, but because that is their nature. That magic is real and present, and many magical capabilities are tied to gods and their cults. For the newcomer, some of these things can be quite daunting to grasp. For example, within the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons, the default position is that gods don't have a direct hand in things, but act in the world through their minions, such as clerics, who wield powers granted to them by the god in question. Characters that aren't clerics or whatnot have no compelling reason to follow a particular deity, or any, except for matters of backstory and so on. Within Glorantha, this isn't really an option. The cults of the gods control quite a chunk of the teaching of magic, and even certain mundane skills, which means that if you want your character to have much in the way of expertise, engaging with one or more cults is almost vital. Picking the cult or cults a character follows is an important part of the character creation process. And when we talk about cults, you do need to think more along the lines of the use of the concept by the ancient Greeks, Romans and others, rather than the modern-day, more negative connotations. Here, belonging to a cult, either as a lay member, initiate, or one with even higher standing, means that a character is contributing to the maintenance of good relations to the deity in return for benefits within the scope of that deity's general influence. Individuals whose daily lives cross areas influenced by more than one god may actually belong to more than one cult, while those that are dedicated themselves to guiding people in the proper ceremonies of the cult, priests and so on, focus on just one. And so the cults form the basis from which knowledge springs, through the teachings of their gods. A farmer may, through his dedication to an agricultural god, receive knowledge of magic that might assist him in his farming chores. A warrior who belongs to a warrior god cult would receive weapons training and magic that enhances his ability in battle and so on. Once you grasp these Gloranthan concepts, that the place is inherently god-made and god-driven, and magic is ubiquitous, then the rest of its elements can be fairly well understood. Why are there talking ducks and baboons? Why is there a random giant block of stone sticking out of the arid plains? Why can a red moon be seen hanging above the burgeoning lunar empire? All of these aspects of Glorantha and more can be understood if its basic foundations are grasped. Beyond that, Glorantha has its own unique patchwork of kingdoms, regions, empires and the like that vie for control of their particular lots in life. Much of this is culture-driven, with overtures of tribalism. Think back to the classical world, where tribes, city-states, kingdoms, empires and so on formed a morass of variety. As a Greek, you could have been an Athenian or a Spartan, the same basic culture but very different within the execution of that culture. Within Glorantha, you might be an Orlanthi, but what that specifically looks like will vary if you come from Sartar, Tarsh or Pavis. The intra and interplay between and within cultures generates a backdrop greater than any geography, creating the seeds for many of the bread-and-butter forms Gloranthan adventures take, raiding a rival tribe, defending your own tribe against such a raid, and so on. Every good mythology and cultural identity also requires a good end story. For the Vikings, this was Ragnarok. For Christians, it is Revelations. Virtually every mythology that has ever been, and is now, has an element of the end times about it. And so it is with Glorantha. Played out in the White Bear and Red Moon board game, the hero wars represent an age where mighty heroes arise to challenge gods, dragons awake, and all manner of apocalyptic events and battles occur. For years, within the role-playing of Glorantha, these end times have been coming, with the latest edition of RuneQuest placing itself firmly on the cusp of their beginnings. For me, I'm not so sure having these end times finally arrive is such a good thing. It is better, I feel, to have them constantly on the horizon rather than arriving on the doorstep. I believe, within gaming, the old World of Darkness proves such a point, especially with some of the hand-waving required to usher in the 5th edition of Vampire. I may be wrong. Perhaps playing RuneQuest through the mighty events of figurative Armageddon and Glorantha could be fun. However, if you are waiting for me to re-mention King of Sartar, well, this is where I will do so, for that book explores this end time and one of its key figures. It is a work that, despite its release in 1993, is becoming more relevant with each passing year in the Chaosium release schedules for Glorantha. Anyway, back on track, perhaps. The ultimate reason why RuneQuest and Glorantha are such a good pairing, despite the obvious that the game was originally written to tie into the world of Greg Stafford's imaginings, is that everything that I have mentioned within the setting is eloquently handled by the rules. To mimic the cults and their influence within, say, Dungeons & Dragons would be impossible within its more structured, more game-abstracted, less simulationist system of classes and levels. With the more open acquisition of skills and spells afforded by the RuneQuest Foundation, where and how those skills and spells can be learned and improved can also be well defined, and thus, tangibly, the power of the cults is described in game terms. The game mirrors the setting, and the setting mirrors the game, and as a result, characters feel Gloranthan straight out of the gate. There's lots to choose from here too, in the form of subsetting. The default is the crossroads of the cultural clash that is Dragon Pass, a central region that is fated to be the stage of the hero wars. This is a patchwork of interacting cultures and kingdoms, and offers plenty of that bread and butter I mentioned earlier. But other areas exist, some less minutely examined as Dragon Pass, some even virtually blank except for a few paragraphs in the Guide to Glorantha or its baby sister, the Glorantha Sourcebook. Some have been given more attention in previous editions, with that material still available in Legacy PDF from Chaosium, or via their own site or DriveThruRPG. For example, my personal favourite playground for Glorantha is Prax and Pavis, which received a lot of love during 2nd and 3rd editions for the RuneQuest game. A final, very important factor that must be iterated and remembered is the hailing call of RuneQuest from throughout the many years of its publications. YGMV, or even YGWV. Your Glorantha may, or will, vary. This is to say that while you as a player or a game master have a plethora of highly detailed esoteria to draw upon, to bring the world or your characters from within it to life at your gaming tables, none of it is set in absolute granite. Greg Stafford's original writings and Chaosium's continued publications and all of that wonderful material present on the Johnstown Compendium is simply a default canon. What happens in your own RuneQuest games from there, well, that's up to you. For me, I can answer the "is it for me" question in three ways. First, Glorantha serves as a template model, an example of a gaming world that has developed homogeneously over time. Elements of its default canon have been changed, erased, rejigged, and otherwise manipulated by its creator and others. This example has given me the confidence to approach the development of my own gaming world in a similar manner. I have been able to throw entire continents away that no longer make sense as my younger self's writings are examined by my older self's, hopefully more knowledgeable standpoint. If Greg could do it with a published world, I surely can with a world that has never, but almost, reached print. Second, it serves as an example of the detail one can drill into when world building. From the mythology of the place to the simple descriptions of various cultures, especially within the narrative interview passages presented by non-player characters as they answer questions regarding their culture or cult or whatever. If you want to know what a town is like, go and ask someone that lives there. Similarly, if you want to know what parts of Glorantha are like, read the background interviews provided in certain product releases to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. And finally, the relationship between RuneQuest and Glorantha serves as an example of what can be achieved when the world and the game are in sync. Even within the most non-D&D worlds of Dungeons & Dragons, Dark Sun or Spelljammer for example, they still feel like D&D. If you plunked a character down in the Forgotten Realms, Greyhawk, Mystara or Kryn, it wouldn't take them long to find their feet in familiarity. The game is separate from the worlds, and the worlds are, more or less, a backdrop. In many ways, creating a character for RuneQuest Glorantha feels like you are bringing an inhabitant of the world to life, rather than creating a game avatar that has some hand-waved connection to the world. The rules and the world here integrate. With RuneQuest and Glorantha, the two reflect each other intrinsically. Sure, there have been additional settings released during the various periods of generic RuneQuest, but they have all felt shoehorned and would have been better off constructing from a core basic role-playing foundation than taking RuneQuest and squashing it in. We are told, in many of those settings, to ignore various chunks of RuneQuest core, which is exactly what basic role-playing was constructed to do. Only within Glorantha has RuneQuest ever felt truly intact and at home. Other than those three major factors for me personally, Glorantha is a fun place to spend some time in. The free Quick Start rules from Chaosium will give you a taste, but I would recommend getting the RuneQuest starter set. Value for money and some really good materials for giving you a taste of the depths that Glorantha possesses. I may approach Glorantha with a more scholastic eye, but that does not mean that playing there isn't a blast too. And that's been my overview in view of the Milieu of Glorantha, the gaming world created by Greg Stafford that is explored primarily through the RuneQuest game. But for now, until the next time, take care.